See you later.
Stop filming me.
Alright.
I can't open the door.
Now why is this all upside down? Is that a problem? G'day everyone, it's Shane here. As you can see, it's wet outside and I was going to do a quick little situation inside with a light, and I'm going to run through how to use the manual settings on your camera. Let's go. So here we are. Here's the setup. We've got a light set up here. We've got a fan to capture movement and a few other objects here which we'll be using to demonstrate depth of field.
It overexposed everything.
Ah, well that's exactly...
You're filming me, aren't you?
I am, but that's what I'm just about to talk about. So you can be my lovely assistant.
Would you like to see the terrible quality of this photograph? Look at that.
Is there not a slider to adjust it?
No.
Because on this camera you can touch
We
the
don't all
screen.
have iPhone 6.
Alright everybody, well we're inside now. That's my daughter Serica. She's going to help me out here. She's not here. What we've got here is my X Pro 2 with I think I've got the 23mm lens on it. So the first thing we're going to do is look at adjusting the aperture using aperture priority. And then we're going to do shutter priority, and then we're going to do fully manual. In my little camera here, I don't have A, TV, S, AV modes. I have just manual dials, but the principle is the same. So if I adjust this now back to the A here, that's my aperture on automatic. And this is my shutter speed here, and if I adjust that, put that on the A there, that's now in automatic. So this is now in fully automatic mode. So if we take a shot there, my screen now is showing you the playback of that shot. So if I show you what the settings are, you'll see it's 220th of a second, or 1/220th of a second at f3.2. Now just notice too, I'm shooting this on ISO 2000 because I'm actually inside and it's almost dusk. So what the camera has done there on fully automatic has attempted to get the best possible exposure out of this scene. Your camera will be set up to do its best to get a good shutter speed. Now a good shutter speed will be something above or faster than say 1/60th of a second, because the camera is going to expect you to be taking this shot handheld. I'm actually shooting this on a tripod because I'm trying to hold a video camera and demonstrate this for you. So now let's change it to aperture priority. Aperture priority is my preferred way of working. Here we go. That's now in aperture priority. I shoot in aperture priority in order to capture what I'd like to capture. In this scene, I want the microphone to be in focus and the background to be out of focus. So I want my depth of field to be narrow or shallow, and therefore I'll pick a low f-stop number, which is actually the widest aperture, the largest hole, and that'll let in the most light that's possible. And therefore, to balance that, to get a good compensation, the camera will automatically pick a faster shutter speed. So currently the automatic was 1/220th of a second at f3.2. Let's see what happens if I go to f2, which is the narrowest depth of field that I can possibly gain with this camera. And I'll focus right there on the microphone and click. Now let's see what the difference is there. The camera is telling me that that last shot was at f2 and 500th of a second. If I go back to the previous one, it was 220th. So if you look at both the shots, at first glance, they're relatively the same exposure, pretty similar. What you might notice is something's happening with the fan. There's a difference there, and in fact there's a difference in the background as well. The jacket is in a slightly, in fact the blue jacket's out of focus more because of the depth of field. Now let's make a change to that. Let's have a very large f-stop number. So go up to say f16 or try f11 and see what the camera does in terms of the speed there. So let's take a shot there. This is still in aperture priority. Okay, and if I play that back, again, we've got a pretty good exposure, but notice the difference. If we look at the settings, this is the most recent shot that I've taken, and prior to that, we had f2 and 500th of a second. And yet the exposure at first glance, I think you would agree, is relatively the same. Those two images are almost In fact, let's go back a few steps. That image and that image and that image, all three images now are virtually, the same exposure. Now the light is changing outside my window, so that's going to get a little bit darker, that's going to affect things. But the biggest difference you should be noticing is in that fan, not that flower. Look at the fan. Fan here is blurred. Fan here is almost frozen, and fan here is almost frozen a little bit more. So the faster the shutter speed, the more chance we have of freezing motion, and the slower the shutter speed, the motion is blurred. But at that slower shutter speed, we have a very small aperture, a very large f-stop, f11, which allows us to get a great depth of field. So notice the difference in the depth of field between that shot and that shot. I'm going to now move my focus point. My focus point is that little green square. I'm just going to move that over now, and I'll focus it on the little ukulele in the background there. So now my ukulele is actually in focus as the point of focus, and the depth of field, the range of focus area in front of that ukulele and in theory behind it, is determined by the aperture, the depth of field given by the aperture. Again, at f11 there would be a relatively large depth of field. At f2, a relatively small one. So let's try that. Let's shoot one here at f2 and one at and one at f16. Okay, let's do it at f16. So you could hear from that shutter release that that's a long shot. And there's the f2 shot, and you can see in the f16 shot the microphone is still in focus, relatively speaking. It's probably not very sharp, it's hard to say in this little screen. So to get a good exposure where everything looks to have the right amount of light in your shot, you mix aperture and shutter speed. If you go up with one, you've got to go down with the other. Okay, so we're recording again. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to go back to automatic, fully automatic, and just see what the automatic settings give us here. So I've got the shutter speed set to A for automatic and the aperture set to A for automatic. And we'll just take a shot from here and see what difference that makes. And I'm going to now focus my little focal point on the fan itself. And we'll see what that automatic setting brings us. And there's my shot. Again, the camera's done its best guess at getting a good exposure. My fan is showing a spinning action. I've captured movement, but I haven't frozen it. I've got a relatively narrow depth of field at f3.6, such that the microphone in the foreground is completely out of focus. So let's now go to shutter speed priority. So I'm going to take this out of automatic. I'm now prioritizing the shutter speed, and the camera will choose the aperture. It's on auto. So I'm going to choose, at the moment, I'll take it at a speed that is, what I should be able to take handheld without any camera blur, which would be 1/60th of a second. So let's try a shot there at 1/60th of a second. 1/60th of a second and f5.6. So it has chosen a slightly deeper depth of field with a larger f-stop at 5.6. And let's have a look at the image. You can see that in the photograph there, when I place it up on the screen, here, because the shutter speed is slower, there's more of a blur caught in the fan. We'll compare that shot, 1/60th to 1/180th. A big difference in the sense of movement. In this one, you can really sort of sense the fan spinning. In this one, you could almost be mistaken for not recognizing that it's turned on because there is such a blur going on. Now let's try adjusting the shutter speed again. Let's try now, we'll turn the shutter speed from 1/60th down to 1/15th. And we'll see what happens there. Okay, again, looking back at the playback, very blurred. We've got an f-stop here of, I believe it's f13. And what's happening now, you can see that the microphone is almost in focus. I mean, it's not really, but it's coming into focus. And we've got 1/15th of a second. So we've got a real blur on the fan compared to
1/60th, which was, you know, you can just see with the 1/60th, you can almost make out some of the blades. Whereas with 1/80th, you can absolutely see 3 blades. So 3 blades to almost 3 blades to no blades at all virtually at 1/15th. Let's go a little bit slower. Let's bring it now down to 1/4 of a second. See if that's going to work. Okay, now you could hear how slow that shutter was. So that's 1/4 of a second and f16. Now what's happening here is we're getting too much light. So my camera has a maximum aperture of f16. So if I go to a really slow shutter speed, in this case 1/4 of a second, my camera can't make the aperture any smaller. So therefore I get too much light and it's overexposed. So your camera will choose the best option it can, but if your camera can't cope with it, you'll either let in too much or too little light, depending on the settings. So again, use your brain, don't just focus on the settings, don't just think that the camera's going to make this work. You have to, in every instance, get the right balance between shutter speed and aperture to have a good exposure. So that's no good, we can't go that slow, but let's have a look at the fan. It's, you know, it's spinning madly. There's a complete blur there. There's no sense of individual fan blades. So let's try to find a good exposure, a good balance. I'm going to bring the speed back to about 1/15th. So there we go, 1/15th of a second. The camera sets f11 and we've got a nice exposure. That's looking just fine. Now let's freeze the fan altogether, or 500th of a second. So at 500th of a second, we've got f2. So again, you can see that the fan blades are almost frozen. And because of the f2 being a very, very large aperture, small f-stop, large aperture, therefore small depth of field, our microphone in the foreground is blurred once again. Now my camera, I can't go any larger than this, my aperture. So therefore I can't, to get a good exposure, I can't increase my speed anymore. We're going to have a poor exposure, I would say. If we try to go to 2000, I believe that little baby is well underexposed because I've made it so fast. In order to freeze the fan, you can see that that fan is totally frozen, but because it's such a short period of time that the aperture was opened, and because my aperture is currently set at its largest size, f2, there's just no way I can get any more light in at this ISO setting. Okay, so last but not least, we're going to do a manual setting, fully manual. So I'm going to put my aperture into manual here, and my shutter speed here, also into manual. So let's just find now a nice exposure using a fully manual setup. So in this instance, I'll have a go at focusing on the microphone again. So I'll move my little focus point back up to the microphone. In fact, I'll put it there. And let's just have a quick snap. I don't even know where I'm set it. I'm just going to try it. Okay, a little bit underexposed. So that's given us f5.6 and 1/500th of a second. So obviously I need to give myself some more light. Firstly, I'll increase the size of my aperture. I'll go down to 3.2. Now you can see that that brings us more light. That is a much better shot than that. So but it's still not very good. That's not a great exposure. So I want to bring more light in. So in order to do that, I'm going to slow down the shutter speed. All right, so we've got that one compared to that one compared to that one. So you can see we're getting closer and closer to a good exposure. In fact, that's not bad, perhaps a little bit underexposed. Now what you can do in this instance is use your light meter. So this is my light meter. So what you're generally aiming for is for that little needle to be close to the zero. Don't expect that the zero is going to be perfect, it won't be. Because what the light meter does is it's trying to guess at what's going to be a good average for all the objects. Now some of the objects in this frame are quite bright and some are quite dull. It's going to do its best to try to pick what it thinks is a good exposure. The only way you can use an exposure compensation dial is when you're in either aperture priority or shutter speed priority. So I'm going to go back to shutter speed, aperture priority by putting my shutter speed into auto. So now I'm in aperture priority. Whatever I do here will be manual,
and the camera will attempt to get a good exposure by adjusting the shutter speed automatically. Now, look, when I put my exposure compensation dial right down to -2, that -2 shows up here on my screen. So I'm telling the camera, no, I think you've got it too bright, take away some of the light. And you can see there in the shot, as I do that, it darkens the shot. Okay, this camera gives me a live view of the exposure. If you think what the camera has chosen in that semi-automatic mode is too dark or too bright, you can add a little bit more light or take away a little bit of light by using this dial. Lovely. I hope that makes sense, and I'll speak to you soon.